Hey.
Hey.
Great. Okay, awesome. I always feel like it's gonna mute me when I come on and I'm like and then no one hears me. Hi Ben, how you doing?
I'm good. How are you, Jesse?
I'm doing good. I'm doing good this Tuesday evening. God bless you guys. Welcome everyone to
Everyone, good
Bible
evening.
study on this Tuesday. You already know, bi-weekly. We're here. You already know where we're going through.
Oh,
We're going through the Old Testament. What book? You'll find out. And if you've seen the title, you already know. But so all that to say, we're so glad to have you with us on this Tuesday. Like we always say, you could be anywhere, but you're here. So God bless. Thank you so much for joining us. Thank you for joining us on this Tuesday. Thank you for tuning in. Thank you for your participation in advance. Ben, thank you for being here with me. How are you? How you doing?
I am ready to go. I'm actually really excited about this book.
Good.
Um, it was, I mean, we're not, there's not a secret here. We're going into the book of Esther.
Yeah.
And I was really excited about this book. When I, uh, actually, my wife is one of her favorite books from the Old Testament. And once I read through it for like the first time completely, I could see why it's such a compelling story. Like it's just like it's such a good story. It like out even outside of scripture, it could have just been a short book, and it would have been just like a nice compelling short story, and it would be like good literature, you know? Like
Yeah. I was telling you, I guess we were discussing like it reminds me of those stories about oh my gosh, there's I feel so silly. There's a name for that time, like Camelot and like King Arthur. I forgot the name, the actual if anybody knows like that time, there's an actual name for it.
medieval.
What medieval times? There you go. That's it, I guess. I feel like it reminds me like of a medieval novel. Like King Arthur, like I said. Like the King Arthur of the Bible. So
Yeah. Well, we're much farther back than medieval times,
oh
that's
yeah,
for sure.
we're in biblical times,
They did
people.
it first.
We're in ancient Israel times.
Yeah.
Um, yeah, for sure. That's definitely
BC.
like BC exactly. Or BM before medieval. But yeah, we are in the book of Esther. Such a beautiful book, and I'm really excited to have you take us through it too. Um, we discussed too, like it's more of a narrative, so it's gonna be really cool to go through it. And it's not super long, so we'll be able to get through the whole thing,
Yeah.
read through it, and just point out have. I think it's a good like you also said that too. There's a good opportunity to have a really good discussion.
Yeah.
So I'm excited for that, and yeah, let's get into it. I'll just have us pray. I'll lead us in prayer really quickly before we start, and then you go. Yeah, look, Pastor Michael. Yes, Middle Ages. Perfect.
Mhm.
That too. There you go. That's what I meant. All that stuff. Medieval Middle Ages. But yeah, let's get started with a word of prayer and then take it away. So God, we thank you. You are faithful. You are a great God, and we're just so grateful even in this, God, to be able to be together, even in this setting, God, to be able to be in the comfort of our homes with our family, our friends, or even just alone, but being able to dive into your word, to read it together, to journey through it together, God, and to discuss it. And at the same time, God, just to be able to see you in this book, to see you in the word of God, which is not your word is not separate from who you are. So we literally seeing you. We're literally learning you. We're literally getting to know you. And that's a beautiful thing, God. And where that does not go unnoticed, that does not go, we're not unappreciative of that. There are people in different countries, in different circumstances, that are not allowed to do this, but here we are. What an honor and a privilege to read your word and to see you and to know you, God. So I pray that, God, you help us to open up our hearts and our minds to what you want to say today, for what you want to show us about you today, that we can see you in everything that we read, Father, and that you reveal yourself to us in a very mighty and special way. I pray you use Ben tonight as he takes us through the book of Esther, Lord. And again, God, We know that you are God, that it's not hidden, God, but you are close and you are there, God. So we thank you and we love you. In Jesus' name I pray. Amen. Amen. Go ahead then. Take it
All
away.
right. We are going to get into it. Now, if you all know me, you won't be surprised by this, but I'm going to give some historical context
Yay.
because I like that and I think it's useful and it helps me center sort of what's going on narratively.
Yay. And I think we have
And
history buffs in the crowd. I like history too.
yeah. Also, if you are just joining us or if you need a recap, we've been going through the narrative of the Old Testament in sort of narrative order, and so we're in Persia with the Israelites. They went into exile in Babylon, and then Persia, the kingdom of Persia, takes over and defeats Babylon and the Median Empire, which were the empires which formerly defeated the Assyrian Empire, all that stuff. And in Persia, we learned through like Ezra and Nehemiah. We also went into the prophetic books of Haggai and Zechariah. We learn about that the Persians had this policy that we even know historically is the case, that whereas former empires had been really like cracking down on people's differences and that incited lots of rebellion, Persia had this strategy of very like culturally tolerant, multicultural policies, and we see that take place. That actually the Persian king gives the Israelites freedom to return to Jerusalem to rebuild it and to rebuild their temple, and that's the narrative that we see playing out in Ezra and Nehemiah, and the challenges that those Israelites have returning to do that. However, this narrative doesn't take place in Jerusalem because not all of the Israelites went back to Jerusalem. Some already had lives and families and jobs that they didn't want to leave behind, and they chose to stay where they were throughout the Persian Empire. And this is about some of those, well, really all of them, but particularly a couple particular Israelites. Now, from this point on, I'll probably stop using the term Israelite because the book itself doesn't really use that term. In fact, if you've been following with us and reading through with us, you might have seen that since the exile, this other term has started to show up in our Bibles, and it's all over Esther, and that term is Jew.
Yeah.
And I thought it would be useful because when I was reading Esther, I was like, yeah, I wasn't seeing this word before, and now I'm seeing Jew used a lot. Why is that? Like, what does it actually mean? Why is it saying Israelite? And do they mean the same thing? And so I did a little digging into it that I would like to share with everyone real quick. It apparently comes from the Hebrew word Yehudi, which I'm sure I'm mispronouncing. I apologize. Which originally actually just referred to someone that was from the tribe of Judah. So there's 12 tribes of Israel, and someone from a tribe of Judah was a Jew. And so that didn't include all the tribes. So what changed? Well, for one, when King Solomon took over after King Solomon died, the kingdom split into two. And as we remember, that northern kingdom was called Israel, but the southern kingdom was called Judah. And so because that kingdom was called Judah, essentially everyone that was part of that nation was now a Jew, even if they weren't from the tribe of Judah. So, for example, one of the characters in Esther is introduced as a Benjamite and a Jew.
Yeah, that's true. Yeah, like and it's like, okay, wait, if you don't know that history, you're like, well, not that the same thing, like.
Right. Well, and essentially what happened is it became like this sort of when they went into exile, when Babylon took Judah into exile, there was already people that were ethnically related to them from Israel that were already in exile, and the term Jew, which originally would have meant just someone at that point from the kingdom of Judah, now just started to become a blanket term for people of that sort of ethnicity.
Yeah.
Somewhat based on misconceptions from the Babylonians, kind of like how Native Americans got called Indians, but it's at this point according to the research I was doing, with a few exceptions, Jew is absolutely acceptable, common term that's accepted and used. as that sort of blanket statement. And in case you're curious, I found on the Jewish Virtual Library described what a Jew is now. And so in case there's confusion, I wanted to read what they had to say about it. They said that a Jew is any person whose mother was a Jew, or any person who has gone through the formal process of conversion to Judaism. It is important to note that being a Jew has nothing to do with what you believe or what you do. A person born to non-Jewish parents who has not undergone the formal process of conversion, but believes everything that Orthodox Jews believe and observes every law and custom of Judaism is still a non-Jew, even in the eyes of the most liberal movements of Judaism. And a person born to a Jewish mother who is an atheist and never practices the Jewish religion is still a Jew, even in the eyes of the ultra-Orthodox. In this sense, Judaism is more like a nationality than like other religions, and being Jewish is like a citizenship. So I thought that sort of gave us a good context, because when I was reading it, I was like, okay, well, this word just popped up. What does it really mean? And so that's essentially what it means. At this point, you can think of it as an ethnicity. It's also a religion. It's really kind of like a nationality.
Okay. So, okay. And I had a question, but I don't know if you would know the
I
answer.
might not know, but
you know, no, I see questions. So then what would a practicing, like in religion, like Jew be considered, or would they be called then? Just a Jew?
Yeah,
Or like,
I don't. If you haven't, all it says there is that if you didn't go through the formal conversion process, then you're not considered a Jew. I don't know if they have a term for that.
Okay.
Because that's all that I went into, so I won't speculate.
Yeah, if anyone at home knows,
yeah,
to share, it'd be great. Like to not because again, like we have more important things to discuss, but I'm curious now. So if you know,
yeah, that was just a sort of a rabbit hole that Esther led me into. I wanted to share it with everyone.
Yeah, that's cool.
Sort of jumping back into the Persian Empire. The Persian Empire. I'm actually going to share a map with you guys. It's very exciting. I love me some maps. So here we've got a map of the Persian Empire. So this story, it'll tell us, takes place in Susa, which sort of was like the effective capital at this time. So it's right here in the middle. And the Persian Empire, it is actually, historically they refer to as the Achaemenid Empire. We're just going to call it the Persian Empire for simplicity's sake here. But it was the biggest empire of its time. And actually, in the first verses of Esther, you see it says there's 127 provinces covering from India to the land of Kush, or Ethiopia, depending on your translation. There's same general area. And so that is all the way over here in India to all the way down here in Kush. And you see that lines up very well with this map, which Kush or Ethiopia would be like near southern Egypt. So this is the scale of the empire at that time. And then, of course, up here in the northwest corner, this is where you have the Greek culture going on, and Persians clash with them, and you get the movie 300. That's not accurate, but it's a cool movie. But you can sort of see as we're approaching, as time and history is continuing to unfold here. Now, the Persians were known, just historically, one of the things we know them for is having is those multicultural policies like we talked about before, and like we've already seen represented in the biblical narrative, and also for like a very impressive infrastructure, particularly in their roads and in their organized postal system. And that system you'll actually sort of see come up in Esther. So I thought that was just a cool piece of history to share with you guys too. So we're about to jump into the story proper. And the last little history thing I'm going to give is that depending on the translation you read, the Persian king in this narrative may be referred to by one of two names. If it's a more sort of word for word translation, it probably has, I'm going to try to pronounce this properly, Ahasuerus, which is essentially a Hebrew name for the Persian king. It's generally accepted that this is probably King Xerxes of the Persian Empire, and Xerxes would have been his sort of like his Persian name. So many translations just use Xerxes, and it is easier to pronounce, and so we're going to use Xerxes as well when we talk through this.
Way better. Like the Bible recap uses King A because they would
Yeah.
pronounce that name either.
So that was the last little bit of that. Now we're going to talk some context as we go through the story, but that's the preface. So we're going to go through the story because it's such like I said before, it's such a cool story in a lot of ways, and it's a unique story. It's a unique book in the Old Testament, honestly, in many ways, and we're going to discuss a lot of those ways at the end. Right before we go into it, I want to actually pre-share one of the key themes of Esther, because I want everyone to sort of think about it, because I would really like everyone to weigh in a little bit when we get through the narrative on their thoughts about this. But a topic that seems to come up a lot in the book of Esther has to do with these concepts, these moments of obedience and disobedience. And we see that pop up in many ways in the book of Esther. And it's not always positive or negative, one or the other, but it brings focus to these moments where someone either obeys something or disobeys something, and they become these important moments in the story. And so one of our key themes is obey or not to obey. And so as we're going through this narrative, and you're thinking about all kinds of things that are going on, think about these like moments of obedience and the way it brings focus onto them and what the narrative might be trying to explore or tell us through that. So the story starts out in Persia, in Susa, which is the citadel that I showed you before. It's the sort of the main city that the king had set up his capital in. And he's throwing a huge party, King Xerxes is. That involves essentially the whole city. And one of the things there's a lot of drinking going on. This is something that's not uncommon in general, but that Persians are particularly known for. In fact, a Greek historian records that they made decisions both while drunk. Well, they debated decisions both while drunk and sober, and the idea had to sound good in both states for it to be accepted.
It's not a good phrase, it's fine.
Yeah, but that's not what's going on here. They're just having a party,
Yeah.
essentially. And in fact, one of the first things it tells us about this is that the king says there's no compulsion for anyone else. And that's related to this practice where typically, if you were at a party with the king, whenever he drank, you had to drink. And what this means is that the king was saying, you don't have to do that. You don't have to, you can get as drunk as you want or as sober as you want, independent of what I'm doing. So that's just what that means. Now we come very quickly to the thing that launches this narrative sort of into action, and it's a moment of disobedience. The king decides to send for his wife, the Queen Vashti, and we'll just read these verses actually. So we're in chapter 1. We'll start at verse 10. I'll have Jesse read them.
Sure. It says, on the 7th day, when King Xerxes was in high spirits from wine, he commanded the 7 eunuchs who served him, Mehuman, Bistha, Harbona, Bigtha, Abaktha, Satar, and Carchus. Well, these names are wild. To bring before him Queen Vashti, wearing her royal crown, in order to display her beauty to the people and nobles, for she was lovely to look at. But when the attendants delivered the king's command, Queen Vashti refused to come. Then the king became furious and burned with anger.
Yeah. So what exactly is going on here? Because when you're reading it just surface level, it can be like, well, what's the big deal? And then if you're trying to see what the big deal is, you might think that there's maybe like a euphemism going on for something here. Now, based on the commentaries that I've read, it's likely that he's not asking Vashti to do anything that we would consider to be like morally compromising, but he is asking her to do something that would be a breach of protocol. It was common in kingdoms of this time, and likely in Persia as well, that most people weren't actually allowed to see the queen. When she would go through the city, there would be like veils around the carriage that she was in, so that people couldn't look directly at her. To see the face of the queen was a privilege that really only the king had, and it was likely that Vashti considered this to be something that was beneath her, to appear in front of others and to be seen by them openly. So it would be a breach of protocol and something she might consider beneath her station as queen. And so that is likely why she takes offense to it and refuses to do so. Now we see that the king gets very angry, and the king decides, well, I don't know what to do. I need to do something. So he talks to some of his advisors, and one of them, Memucan, has some advice for the king. We'll read that in verse 16.
Okay. It says, Then Memucan replied in the presence of the king and the nobles, Queen Vashti has done wrong, not only against the king, but also against all the nobles and the peoples of all the provinces of King Xerxes. For the queen's conduct will become known to all women, so they will despise their husbands and say, King Xerxes commanded Queen Vashti to be brought before him, but she would not come. This very day, the Persian and the Median women of the nobility. You want me to keep reading, right? To 20?
Yeah.
Okay, sorry. Nobility who have heard about the queen's conduct will respond to all the king's nobles in the same way. There will be no end of disrespect and discord. Therefore, if it pleases the king, let him issue a royal decree, and let it be written in the laws of Persia and Media, which cannot be repealed, that Vashti is never again to enter the presence of King Xerxes. Also, let the king give her royal position to someone else who is better than she. Then, when the king's edict is proclaimed throughout all his vast realm, all the women will respect their husbands from the least to the greatest.
So you can see the immediate concern that this brings up for everyone is essentially, well, if Queen Vashti can disobey the king, they're worried, well, now all of the women are going to disrespect their husbands, and they don't like the sound of that. The king essentially decides, okay, sounds like a good idea, and this is something that the king will do a lot in this story. And he issues a decree. Let's read verse 22, which is the actual decree that gets put out.
He sent dispatches to all parts of the kingdom, to each province in its own script, and to each people in their own language, proclaiming that every man should be ruler over his own household, using his native tongue. Man, he really wanted them to get it.
Yeah. Yeah. And it's a particular thing. I find it personally an interesting phrasing. Based on the initial problem, the idea that every man should be the ruler of his own household feels almost more widespread than just marital relations. And it seems like, doesn't this overflow into like can you enter his property? Like if he's literally the ruler of his, but that's I think beyond, that's in the weeds a little bit. But the wording seems interesting and intentional, and it does remind us a lot about it being in their own language, their own script. Like you said, you really wanted to make sure they all understood.
Yeah.
So, real quick, so what's happening with Queen Vashti here? From what we can tell, I mean, there's a divorce essentially that's happening. And this is going to come up later, but we'll talk about it now. The Persian king, had a harem, and essentially you could think about, he had one wife who was the queen, but he still had a harem. And what likely is said to be happening here is that he's divorcing Vashti, and then she would technically remain in the harem, but would be demoted in it, and probably never get to see Xerxes again, as they were saying. And obviously one of the issues, while she's technically still in the palace, she now has no relations, but she also can't have a family. She doesn't have any power anymore. So it's a divorce and a demotion. It's not necessarily like an exile, but it's close to it. It's like being exiled in your own home. So then what happens? Well, chapter 2, we get into chapter 2, and the king wants another queen. And the genius idea that everyone comes up with is, well, we'll just gather all the beautiful unmarried women in the kingdom, and then we'll bring them to the harem, and then you can just basically choose the one that you like the most to be queen.
Right.
Yeah. So this is actually, I feel like earlier maybe I should have also mentioned that this story does deal a lot with what's the word? uh
Oh, scandal,
Scandal,
drunkenness,
yeah, um
the appropriate,
plenty of inappropriate things
yeah,
that we kind of have to talk about in order to talk about the story. And it's a very important part of the narrative.
yeah. Veggie Tales is a really good retelling of this for kids. Is definitely not the Veggie Tales version when you read
The,
it in the
no,
Bible.
no, for sure. And it's ultimately it's a very blunt display of the fractured relationship here between man and woman, and the abuse that's been coming about at the hands of these nations, these and the governments and the kings and all those types of things.
Yeah,
And so, sorry, what?
no, no, I'm saying you're right. Like, it just shows again the depravity and how terrible, like, just like humanity is, even at this point.
Mhm,
Um, for the fact, like, I was reading commentaries as to like why, because the Bible doesn't tell us, like, or the story, because it doesn't tell us why she refused to show herself, like, or this was like even the first time she was asked to do that. Like, we don't have any background as to why she said no,
mhm,
right? But they speculate like it could have been that though we read that he asked her to show herself in her crown, he could have meant her crown and only her crown, like to use her as an object, right? To show her like that, or she maybe was put in this position before, and these men are drunk, and they could have, would have been embarrassing, humiliating to her.
mhm,
And you have people that just give their opinion as to maybe why, based on these times and just how even a queen, she's a queen, but like because she's a woman, how there was this like treatment of women, right? Whether
right.
it be,
And
and,
and like you said, it doesn't actually tell us why. In fact, there's going to
yeah,
be a few times where someone does something, and the Bible doesn't tell us why, even though it seems like a natural question.
yeah,
Um, and just his like the context that I gave before is just the historical context of what we know about Persia and their protocols. You can at the very least assume that there's something is being asked of her that could be perceived as offensive.
mm,
It's unclear whether or not it was putting her in physical danger or not. That's just not, we don't have that context, so
yeah,
we don't
you
know.
know,
The what tells us about the absence of the narrative of the person recording the story saying why, not saying why, say Vashti refused, is that the reason for that refusal is not something we're apparently supposed to linger on. It's not important to the
yeah,
core narrative. The narrative has a sort of, at this point, it's just telling you things that are happening without judging them,
yeah,
right? It's saying this is just what happened and this is what the king did, and it's not talking in disapproval or approval of any of those things. It's
yeah,
just telling you the story right now.
yeah, for sure.
um so after this decision is made, that the king says, well, okay, we're going to just gather as a bunch of beautiful women, include them in the harem, and then eventually I'll choose one. We're introduced to one of our really, the king being the first main character. We're introduced to our second main character, and this is Mordecai. If we could read chapter 2, verses 5 and 6, it'll give us that introduction.
Now there was in the citadel of Susa a Jew of the tribe of Benjamin, named Mordecai, son of Jair, the son of Shimei, the son of Kish, who had been carried into exile from Jerusalem by Nebuchadnezzar. king of Babylon, among those taken captive with Jehoiakim, king of Judah.
So what's really important about the way that they introduce him is, so remember, genealogies matter in the Bible.
Yes.
So what this, in short, what this genealogy does is it reminds us of King Saul. It does that in two clear ways. One, it's telling us that he was a tribe of Benjamin, which is the same tribe King Saul was. But then most importantly, it mentions the ancestor named Kish, who
Mm.
was the same name as King Saul's father.
Mm.
And so the reason it goes back that far to bring up Mordecai's great-great-grandfather, one of the reasons is to remind us of King Saul. And we're going to talk about more about why it might do that later, and it'll become more clear. But I want to point that out just off the bat. So here we got Mordecai, right?
Mm.
Now, immediately afterwards, we get introduced to our third main character, the main character, if the title of the book tells you anything, and that is Esther. We'll read her introduction here in verse 7.
Mordecai had a cousin named Hadassah, whom he had brought up because she had neither father nor mother. This young woman, who was also known as Esther, had a lovely figure and was beautiful. Mordecai had taken her as his own daughter when her father and mother died.
So Esther is Mordecai's cousin, and Mordecai essentially adopted her. Is how we could put it. Now, there's a few interesting things. So there's these two names that are given for her. Hadassah is her Jewish, like Hebrew name, whereas Esther is a Persian name.
Mm.
And what's interesting about that, real quick, the name Hadassah means like myrtle tree, which was associated with peace and prosperity, which I think is interesting given the context of the story. Esther, being a Persian name, literally means star, but there's something interesting going on here, because if you write the name in Hebrew, the root letters form the Hebrew word for hide or hidden. And what's really interesting about that is, of course, Esther will hide her Hebrew identity by using the name Esther.
Yes.
And so there seems to be sort of a wordplay almost going on here, which is just really cool. And it's one of the ways that names are used often in the Bible that we can overlook because their names aren't transparent to us as they might have been for someone reading it in its original language. So what happens is that, as it tells us, since Esther is just so lovely, she gets included in the roundup of women that are brought to the harem as to be potentially a queen. We could read, do we have chapter 2, verse 7?
Yes, we do.
Oh, wait, sorry, we just read that one.
You mean
Sorry.
8 through 11?
8 through 11, yeah.
No problem. Yeah, it says, when the king's order and edict had been proclaimed, many young women were brought to the citadel of Susa and put under the care of Hegai. Esther was also taken to the king's palace and trusted to Hegai, who had charge of the harem. She pleased him and won his favor. Immediately he provided her with beauty treatments and special food. He assigned to her 7 female attendants selected from the king's palace and moved her and her attendants into the best place in the harem. Esther had not revealed her nationality and family background because Mordecai had forbidden her to do so. Every day, he walked back and forth near the courtyard of the harem to find out how Esther was and what was happening to her.
So a few things going on here. So Hegai actually was introduced earlier a little bit, but he's the eunuch who's in charge of the harem. A little historical context, and like I already said, we got to talk about some weird and uncomfortable things. If you don't know what a eunuch is, it's probably a good time to explain that. Eunuch was essentially a man who had been castrated.
Yeah.
And the reason that they were so important was they presented much less threat to the people that they serve. So, for example, Hegai could be trusted to be in charge of the harem because he was technically, in theory, not a threat to any of the women. He could not have a sexual relationship with any of the women in the harem. A eunuch was less likely to try to overthrow the king because they could never have an heir to surpass them eventually. And so eunuchs were considered like necessary to put into trusted positions within a kingdom's to manage certain things in the king's possession, and that included the harem. So we see that she wins favor with Haggai. He apparently likes her a lot. She must have a great personality, and we're told that she keeps her Jewish identity a secret. She keeps it hidden. And she does this specifically because Mordecai asked her to. So this is another interesting moment where we're seeing like this emphasis on Esther's being obedient to Mordecai's wisdom. Now, why Mordecai actually asked her to do this is, again, never told. Just like Vashti disobeying the king, we are actually told why Mordecai tells her to keep it secret. As far as we know, there wouldn't have been a prejudice against Esther as a Jew at this time yet. Not at least in the eyes of most of the people in Susa. They lived there for the most part, and we aren't told that was the case. But again, just like Vashti's disobedience, it seems like we aren't told because it's not something we're meant to focus on. What's important is that Mordecai does make this request of Esther, and that Esther chooses to obey and listen to him. And that becomes, of course, very important in this story. Mm-hmm. So we're told actually in here, if you read it, that when the girls came into the harem, they went through a whole year of beauty treatments before they ever spent their night with the king. But eventually Esther's turn for that came around, and how it tells us that it worked was when it was one of the girls' turn to have their night with the king. They could bring anything they wanted with them, and they would spend the night, and then they would come back in the morning, and they would only ever see the king again if he specifically requested them. Basically, if he really liked them and wanted them to come back.
Yeah.
So they could take anything they wanted, but Esther chooses to only take what Haggai recommends. He's been seeing this go on for a while. She chooses to trust in his wisdom about what she should bring.
Well, about this process and everything.
Yeah, right, yeah. Exactly. So in chapter 2, verse 15, if we could read that, we could see specifically how it sort of words it here.
When the turn came for Esther, the young woman Mordecai had adopted, the daughter of his uncle Abihail, to go to the king, she asked for nothing other than what Haggai, the king's eunuch, who was in charge of the harem, suggested, and Esther won the favor of everyone who saw her.
So she's winning favor all over the place, apparently, which is important. And she listens to Haggai's wisdom, similar to how she's listened to Mordecai's wisdom. If we read verse 17, we can see the fruits of that. Mm-hmm. If you can call them that.
He says, now the king was attracted to Esther more than to any of the other women, and she won his favor and approval more than any of the other virgins. So he set a royal crown on her head and made her queen instead of Vashti. And then, do you know how long this process took?
Yeah, I mean, at least a year.
Yeah, it's a long time to make up your mind.
Yeah, theoretically, and in theory, for at least an entire year, probably a little more, he's been just going through this harem.
Yeah, like I heard a commentary saying that they think it might have been like 1,500 days, and I was like, come on, man, make up your mind at this point. Come on, dude.
I think the king would have more important things to do, wouldn't you?
I know.
Apparently not. But if we jump forward to verse 20 now, I want us to see how it puts this here. It reminds us of Esther not revealing her identity.
But Esther had kept secret her family background and nationality, just as Mordecai had told her to do. But she continued to follow Mordecai's instructions, as she had done when he was bringing her up.
So it reminds us not just that she was concealing her Jewishness, but that she was doing it. Reminds us also that she was doing it because Mordecai told her, and that she had been uh, following Mordecai's instructions all through bringing her up.
Yeah.
Now, that can tell us a lot too, that while she may not understand, if she's been following Mordecai's instructions her whole life and that has turned out pretty well, she has a level of faith in Mordecai to say, well, I don't necessarily understand why you might ask me to do that, but I'm going to trust you. And that's apparently what she's doing. But again, it doesn't tell us why she's following it or why she always did, just that she is listening to what he said.
Yeah. And what's cool is that you touched on the key theme earlier, to obey or not to obey.
Mm-hmm.
What we see about her already is that she's willing to obey, like she's willing to listen to counsel.
Yes.
And she seeks out counsel and she's willing to listen.
Yeah.
And we see how it's works out in her favor. And so this is how we also see like what God has been trying to tell us from the beginning, right? In the Old Testament, like kind of like how obedience like is so important.
Right.
How it leads to life. We're gonna see that here already in the way she lives her life, in listening to wise counsel and obeying that, like seeking to do that.
Now, of course, it's worth saying that being brought into the harem of the king is not the best thing in the world to happen to you, and that's not the result of her obedience. That's the result of the king's action.
Yes.
But her obedience brings her into this position of favor and into this position, which is the best position to be in that situation, which is the queen. Then we're given a story, so now she's been made queen, and Mordecai's been hanging out at the palace gates, before, to figure out what was going on with her. And now that she's the queen, it's so that he can talk to like her servants, and they can talk to each other through messages that they give to the servants and things like that, check in, see how things are going. And while he's there at the gate, Mordecai overhears a plot to assassinate the king, and he tells Esther about it, who in turn tells the king on Mordecai's behalf. And it tells us that and they investigated it. They found that it was true and it was dealt with. They killed the conspirators. They put their bodies on poles, I believe it tells us, as was typical at the time. The poles are going to come up again. And then they write down in the book of the King's Chronicles what Mordecai did. Wow. Then we get to chapter 3. And our final key character is introduced. We have had the king, who is sort of this, I'll call him loosely a neutral character, in the sense that so far he's mostly just done what other people say to do, and mostly while drunk. And then we had Mordecai and Esther, who are sort of these protagonists. Now we're going to be introduced to the antagonist. So if we can just read chapter 3, verse 1.
After these events, King Xerxes honored Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, elevating him and giving him a seat of honor higher than that of all the other nobles.
Haman. So you'll notice that unlike Mordecai, it didn't give us nearly as much genealogy, because it gave us everything we needed to know, essentially. Yeah. And the particular piece here that's of particular note is the Agagite. So what that makes us think of, and I mentioned this, right? So remember that Mordecai reminds us of King Saul. So we've seen the name. So an Agagite would be, by definition, a descendant of someone named Agag. Have we heard of someone named Agag in the Bible so far? Well, in fact, we have. Back in 1 Samuel, one of King Saul's enemies was a king named Agag, and he was specifically the king of a group of people known as the Amalekites. And this is of particular interest because not only was this king a rival of King Saul, who we've seen associated with Mordecai, but King Agag and the Amalekites were a group that through the prophet Samuel, God had commanded that Saul wipe them all out, and destroy all their possessions and all of their animals. However, King Saul doesn't fully obey this. He at first keeps King Agag alive, keeps a bunch of the animals, and it's this big moment of disobedience that leads to Samuel saying that God's going to find another king who will eventually be King David. And so it's this huge fall narrative of King Saul that's associated with here. So one, it connects with, again, our theme of obedience, because it reminds us of this huge moment in Israel's narrative where their first king that they had chosen disobeyed God. It also is important because it gives us immediate context that without knowing anything about these characters, we can expect that Haman and Mordecai are going to sort of beef on sight. It sort of tells us to just expect that Haman is going to be an adversary to our main characters. Yeah. Now, whether or not he's actually an Amalekite or not is not really clear. Just because he's descended of someone named Agag doesn't necessarily make him an Amalekite, but I think it's certain that the narrative brings up that because it's to give us a narrative context for understanding what's going to come about. Now, if he is a descendant of the Amalekites, what's interesting about that is then he's also, what follows is a fallout consequence of King Saul not obeying God in those times.
Yes.
And it also brings context to Haman would have prejudice against the Jewish people.
Yes.
If he was a descendant of these people who were nearly wiped out by them. So there's a lot of these interesting things going on. Now, actually, when King Saul disobeys back in 1 Samuel, I would like us to read from 1 Samuel chapter 15, verses 21 and 22, because King Saul says his excuse to Samuel when Samuel's like, why didn't you obey the word of God? And he's like, well, I kept these animals because we could use them as like sacrifices to God. And this is what this is what he says here. So it starts off, these are the words of Saul in verse 21.
The soldiers took sheep, excuse me. Sorry. The soldiers took sheep and cattle from the plunder, the best of what was devoted to God, in order to sacrifice them to the Lord your God at Gilgal. But Samuel replied, does the Lord delight in burnt offerings and sacrifices as much as obeying the Lord? To obey is better than sacrifice, and to heed is better than the fat of rams.
To obey is better than sacrifice. Yeah. I want us to just remember that, and we'll come back to it later. So, we now have the scene set with all of our characters, right? We have the king who's drunk and a womanizer. We have Mordecai, who's a Jew and has this daughter Esther, who's now queen. And Esther has been keeping her identity secret. And we have Haman now, who we don't know much about, but they've introduced him in such a way for us to expect him as an adversary. Now, we'll read because this is where the conflict really shows up. Chapter 3, verses 2 and 3.
It says, all the royal officials at the king's gate knelt down and paid honor to Haman. For the king had commanded this concerning him, but Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor. Then the royal officials at the king's gate asked Mordecai, why do you disobey the king's command?
Interesting. So this isn't quite like, say, in Daniel, where there's a command to bow and worship the king or that statue. Here, we saw in the first verse where they introduced Haman that the king had promoted him to essentially being his right-hand man. It was a high rank, if you will, and bowing would have been the way that you showed respect for that rank. Similar to how, like, in the military, you salute to someone who has a higher rank than you. Mm-hmm. So this wasn't an act of worship that was being asked. It was about showing the proper respect.
Yes.
But Mordecai refuses to recognize this position, and in doing so, he's disobeying the king, which the people around observe. If you aren't showing respect to this person who's been elevated by the king, then you're disobeying the king. Now, again, it doesn't tell us right now why Mordecai does this. Now, Mordecai sort of gives an interesting justification for this, and we'll read that here, verses 4 and 6.
Day after day, they spoke to him, but he refused to comply. Therefore, they told Haman about it to see whether Mordecai's behavior would be tolerated, for he had told them he was a Jew. But he told Esther not to say that.
Right?
So, take your own advice, bud. What happened? No. So when Haman saw that Mordecai would not kneel down or pay him honor, he was enraged. Yet having learned who Mordecai's people were, he scorned the idea of killing only Mordecai. Instead, Haman looked for a way to destroy all Mordecai's people, the Jews throughout the whole kingdom of Xerxes.
Yeah, so like you said, it's interesting that he apparently told them that he was a Jew, which is to do the opposite of what he told Esther to do. Mm-hmm. And he seems to almost have given this as a justification for not bowing down to Haman, which could give more credence to the fact that Haman was potentially actually an Amalekite. And again, that beef on sight, maybe it was just too much for Mordecai to handle. And Haman's severe retaliation also could lend credence to that. But it's an interesting. He's like, no, I didn't bow down because I'm a Jew, and that's all that Mordecai seems to have said about that. And in doing so, breaks the command that he gave to Esther.
Yeah.
So now Haman's mad, and he just doesn't want to kill Mordecai. He wants to kill all of the Jews, and so he hatches a plot. Let's see in verse 7.
In the 12th year of King Xerxes, in the first month, the month of Nisan, the pur, that is the lot, was cast in the presence of Haman to select the day and month, and the lot fell on the 12th month, the month of Adar.
So these pur, or these lots, you can sort of think about them as like dice. So they would be tossed, and then if they landed on the right thing, then it would mean that was a particular. In this case, what they're trying to do is select what would be the luckiest month for Haman to go make a request to the king and for it to be approved. And so here we're seeing that Haman's sort of like trying to, there's almost a divination going on. At the very least, he's trying to abuse fate and circumstance. What's interesting about this is that when you analyze these dates, Haman actually waits about like 5 years to actually make this request of the king. Like 5 years pass here of him just casting these lots each month, waiting to see what the sign that he thinks means that's the month to go to the king. But he does go to the king in the month that the pur decide, and we read his request to the king in verses 8 and 9.
Chapter 3, verse 8 and 9. There you go. Sorry. I have it a little out of order, but I found it. Okay. Then Haman said to King Xerxes, there's a certain people dispersed among the peoples in all the provinces of your kingdom who keep themselves separate. Their customs are different from those of all other people, and they do not obey the king's laws. It is not in the king's best interest to tolerate them. If it pleases the king, let a decree be issued to destroy them, and I will give 10,000 talents of silver to the king's administrators for the royal treasury. It kind of honestly reminds me of Daniel. Like now reading it now, kind of like the king's advisors when they told him that he should put that decree that no one should pray, right?
Yeah.
Then it would be like kind of in the sense that they wouldn't be giving the king the respect because they're busy praying to their God, right? Yeah, like these people are not gonna, they keep themselves separate, their cousins are different. You know what? Let a decree be issued to destroy them. There you go. Like it kind of reminds me that now that I'm reading it. And
so it's interesting. So his appeal, Haman's appeal to the king, rests on a perceived danger of a group of people that are different from them, and that they could risk disobeying the king and rebelling. What it personally reminds me of a lot is in Egypt.
Okay.
right? At the beginning of Exodus, what they say is that as the people increased in number in Egypt, they
Yes.
essentially like were afraid of them, and so that's when they decided to try to enslave them because they were worried they might rise up against them or join their enemies. So very similar things going on here. They're like these people, well, they're keeping themselves separate because they're set apart,
Mm-hmm.
and he even says, well, they might disobey. They disobey the king's laws.
Yeah.
Now, one thing that might be easy to overlook, especially if you've been like watching movies based on the story, is that Haman here is not telling the king what group of people this is. He doesn't mention the Jews. He just says there's a group of people.
Mm.
And that's important to remember later with some of the way the king reacts to certain things, which can be seen confusing if you think that the king knows what group of people it is that he sentenced to death. He doesn't. he
Kind of reckless king. Oh,
yeah.
but
I mean, but we've seen him already in the story. Are we
yeah.
surprised? So the king decides to, and Haman even says, like, I'm going to donate money to this, right? To this plan. The king agrees, and he gives Haman his signet ring, which essentially allows Haman to make a decree in the king's name. That ring could have been used as like a seal for a scroll, and that seal meant this scroll and its contents come with the authority of the king, and that's really important. And it's interesting. Something the king says is he says, "Do with them as it seems good to you," which, if we were bringing up like past sort of like key themes about like good and evil and good in your own eyes and things like that. Do with them as it seems good to you, he says. And so Haman crafts a decree, and we're going to read that chapter 3, verses 12 through 15.
Then on the 13th day of the first month, the royal secretaries were summoned. They wrote out in the script of each province and in the language of each people all Haman's orders to the king's satraps, the governors of the various provinces, and the nobles of the various peoples. These were written in the name of King Xerxes himself and sealed with his own ring. Dispatches were sent by couriers to all the king's provinces with the order to destroy, kill, and annihilate all the Jews, young and old, women and children, on a single day, the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar, and to plunder their goods. A copy of the text of the edict was to be issued as law in every province and made known to the people of every nationality so they would be ready for that day. Again, they try to make sure they know. The couriers went out, spurred on by the king's command, and the edict was issued in the citadel of Susa. The king and Haman sat down to drink, but the city of Susa was bewildered. And that tells you something, right? That the city was bewildered by this edict. Like,
yeah,
to be like shocked, right, or surprised. Like, what is this?
It's also going to show that there's not necessarily a reason to think that there would have been like an overwhelming prejudice against the Jews for the city in general to be like, what's going on with this? Like, yes. Why?
Yes. Exactly.
Now, something that I personally would never have noticed if it wasn't for my Bible commentary is that the timing of this edict, it was written on the 13th of the month of Nisan and it would have been distributed on the 14th. The 14th day of Nisan was the day they celebrated Passover.
Yes. Okay. I was going to say Nisan sounds familiar to me. I know we just talked about this.
So just as all the Jews are celebrating their like initial deliverance from Egypt, which this is all kind of reminding us of, is that right? They're told that there's going to be a systemic annihilation of all of them in the near future.
Wow.
Which is crazy, right?
Yeah.
And understandably so, a lot of them go into mourning, and it sends the city into sort of a little bit of chaos as even people who are non-Jews are just like, what's going on? Now, let's talk a second about the decree. What the decree essentially does, because the wording might seem a little confusing, it essentially gives state sanction for violence against the Jews on a particular day. So it essentially says, on this day, you're allowed to kill Jews and to take their stuff, things which would have normally been illegal.
Yeah.
it's kind of like the purge, except the Jews have no right to defend themselves. Even if they raised swords, so to speak, to defend themselves, they would then be in rebellion against the empire.
Yeah.
So they're caught in a really difficult place where there's nothing that they can do.
Yeah. Lindsay pointed out something cool about Nissan. I think Lisa pointed it out last time too, last Bible study. Said we're in the month of Nissan now. Today's the first day. She was talking about that. It's coming up.
Yeah.
We're in that month currently. That's really
so. It's a great time to be going through Esther for sure.
cool. Yeah, so timely.
So Jews all throughout the empire. Well, and we saw that postal service at work there, by the way.
And at least they're consistent and
Yeah.
they're really communicating. They want to make sure you know. So
Jews all throughout the empire, of course, they go into mourning, and it tells us specifically Mordecai puts on sackcloth and ashes. We've talked about this in the past. These are typical signs of mourning, and he's crying out the city, and he's going to the gate. He's crying out at the gate, and of course, the servants are like, "Hey, Esther, your adopted dad is being weird at the gate." To them that might seem what it is because this was a Jewish custom. But Esther knows, well, he's in mourning, and so she sends garments to cover him. Mordecai refuses, and he sends a message to Esther with a copy of the edict so that Esther knows what's going on, because Esther didn't. There would be no purpose to declaring this edict in the palace. So Esther doesn't know what's going on.
wow.
So Esther then learns about it from Mordecai. And so Mordecai essentially pleads with Esther. He's like, you're the queen. You have to do something. You have to plead with the king on behalf of your people. But there's a problem with that. And Esther lays it out for Mordecai here in verse 4 in chapter 4, verse 11. This is Esther speaking.
All the king's officials, yes. She says, all the king's officials and the people of the royal provinces know that for any man or woman who approaches the king in the inner court without being summoned, the king has but one law. They be put to death, unless the king extends the gold scepter to them and spares their lives. For 30 days have passed since I was called to go to the king.
So the dilemma is, if she just walks into the king, she could get killed for it. And if he's not happy to see her, and she's like, it's been like a month since he asked to see her, so she's not sure he'd be happy to see her, right?
Yeah.
But the situation's dire. So here's what Mordecai says in verses 13 and 14. And this blew me away when I read it, Mordecai's words.
He sent back this answer. Do not think that because you are in the king's house, you alone of all the Jews will escape. For if you remain silent at this time, relief and deliverance for the Jews will arise from another place. But you and your father's family will perish. And who knows but that you have come to your royal position for such a time as this. Powerful, bold, and powerful.
It's bold and powerful. Like, I was like, it's just such a demonstration of faith, because his concern is not if they're going to be saved, it's how they're going to be saved. Right? And that's just powerful to me.
Yeah, like he has no doubt they're going to be saved.
Like, yeah, they're going to be saved. But he's like, you want to be, because, and you can kind of see, I think, what's going through his head. Because if you think about historically how God's been working, oftentimes that's involved a foreign empire coming in and clearing house, right? That happened with Babylon and Assyria and even the Persians, right? And the Israelites themselves going into the promised land. So historically, he's like, if it doesn't come from within, if the deliverance doesn't come from within, it's going to come from without, and that's not going to be good for the royal family. And Esther, you're a part of the royal family. So it's just his logical progression, which is predicated on his faith, is just very powerful and fascinating to me. And I think it speaks volumes. Just that it's not a question of if, it's a question of how. So then, so in verses, sorry, what? Did I break up? Are you there?
No, I said that's so good. It's so.
Yeah.
Yeah. I'm here. Do you hear me?
Yes.
My streamer was giving me a signal that my reception is not great, my Wi-Fi. So I don't know why, but I'm here. I hear you. So if you
Okay.
hear me weird, just let me know. I'm sorry about that. This should resolve itself. Sorry about that.
No worries. So let's just read Esther's response in chapter 4, verses 16 and 17.
Go gather together all the Jews who are in Susa and fast for me. Do not eat or drink for 3 days, night or day. I and my attendants will fast as you do. When this is done, I will go to the king, even though it is against the law. And if I perish, I perish. So Mordecai went away and carried out all of Esther's instructions.
If I perish, I perish. Pretty famous words from this book. Um, and so a powerful resolution in response to Mordecai's, uh, I would call it encouragement. in response to Mordecai's encouragement, Esther makes a bold decision. She says, "Of course, like I have to try because he's right. I mean, it's a potential win for a certain news if you have faith that they will be saved."
Yeah.
So she says, "I'll take the risk," but she doesn't take the risk without proper preparation. And so she asks Mordecai and the Jews in Susa and her with her attendants, who would not be Jewish people, to likely to fast in preparation.
Mm-hmm.
And so and in that way, she's also joining the rest of her Jewish people in their mourning. So then, and of course, what's interesting is that up until this point, we've seen how willing Esther is to be obedient. And here she's facing where she has this moment where she has to be disobedient to a particular person in order to be obedient to someone else, or in a way, obedient to God.
Yeah. Yeah, it just shows you again, like more examples of her willingness to be obedient.
Mm-hmm.
And we will continue to see in the story um the fruit of that, or the result of that, and God showing us that how um how like what the fruit of obedience, and
Mm-hmm.
what it means to seek wisdom and listen and obey, from seek God's wisdom and obey his wisdom.
Yeah. And we see that she's even in this where she knows she's going to have to be disobedient.
Mm-hmm.
She's not rash about it. She humbles herself firstly before God in
Yeah.
her fasting, right? And so we see even when she makes that decision of I need to be in this moment bold and disobedient, she does it in such a she has such humiliation, or wait, that's not
Humility.
humility. Goodness
Yes.
gracious, not humiliation. She has such humility in that.
Yeah.
So we get to chapter 5, and the moment is at hand. Esther goes to the king after the 3 days of fasting. She goes on the third day. And when she appears to the king, he doesn't have her put to death. In fact, he seems very happy to see her. And he seems to know that she's there to ask something of him, because he says, "Esther, what's your request? It shall be given to you, even to half of my kingdom." And there's a really funny note
It's
that's
crazy.
like, yeah, there's a really funny note in my commentary that's like, that says like Persian kings sort of like had a history of making like bold promises like this that came back to bite them, and it like cites a story with another king or something. So that just sounded funny to me. But and she could have said it right there, but she decides not to. Instead, Esther says, "I want you and Haman to come to a feast that I prepared."
Mm.
And so the king says, "Great, sounds awesome. Someone quick, go find Haman, and let's go to this feast." And so they go to the feast, and the king knows that the feast isn't what she wanted. He knows that there's something that she wants. And so at the feast, he repeats his question of like, "Well, what is it that you want?" And Esther says, "Come to the feast tomorrow, and then I'll do as the king has said," which as into, I will answer your question tomorrow. So then Haman, who's been at this feast with them, goes home and he's sort of got a big head about it because he's just been at a private feast with the king and the queen. That's big deal.
Yeah.
Right? But when he's leaving, he passes Mordecai, who's still not bowing in front of him. Now, I'm not here to judge Mordecai too much, but like this has thrown their whole people into crisis. But it's all right; it's not going to change now. So Haman's still very angry about that. He goes home, he boasts to his family about and his friends about how he has Esther's favor and he was at a private banquet with the king and the queen. But he's still mad at Mordecai. So Haman's wife has this idea. His wife and his friends sort of come up with this idea where they're like, "We'll tell the king to have Mordecai hung on a pole before the feast tomorrow." Now, what's interesting about this is that, especially based on the fact that he seems to have so much favor with them, they seem to think that he can just tell the king to do something now. So that's a really bold thing to suggest, where they're like, just have the king do this, right? That's like a huge thing to say.
He's your boy. That's what you want to do.
Yeah, you're right. Now, I want to note here, and we might have seen it before already, but your translation may refer to these what I'm calling poles as gallows, which isn't necessarily wrong. But when you think of gallows, we typically think of like the colonial like noose where you're hung by neck until dead type of thing. That's what I think of when I hear gallows. But this would have been, we talked about this with the Assyrians and stuff. This would have been like a tall pole that a body was impaled on for display, essentially. It wasn't a form of execution. Typically, the person was killed and then their body was put on the pole. And it was a way of intimidation and of fear and of making an example, essentially, of showing the power and the authority of the kingdom. So they're saying, we'll just have that done to Mordecai. And Haman says, that's a great idea, and he makes a huge pole outside of his house already. He has it erected for it before he's even made the request. Now we get into chapter 16. So that night, the king just so happens to not be able to sleep. We don't know why. He seems to be having a pretty good time. There's nothing to keep him up anxious. He just went to a nice banquet with his wife. One of his higher ups, donated a bunch of money. Like, things are going all right, but he can't sleep. So he says, well, I need something to put me to sleep. So I'm going to have someone essentially read a boring book to me. And so they read to him the Chronicles of Memorable Deeds. And lo and behold, they happen to read the section that tells how Mordecai had saved the king's life by discovering a plot against him. And the king has this awareness suddenly where he's like, well, that was awesome that he did that. He saved my life. What did we do for Mordecai? And his servants are like, we didn't do anything. We said, thank you, bye. And he's like, well, and so the king is deliberating on this in the morning when Haman enters to make a request to the king to have Mordecai killed and impaled on a pole. But before Haman can make this request, the king's here deliberating on this problem, and he goes and he says, oh, great, Haman, you're here. Let me get your advice on something. I really want to honor someone. How should the king honor someone? And Haman is very mistakenly believes the king is talking about him, that the king wants to honor him. And so he has this elaborate plan. We can read this in chapter 6, verses 7 to 9. We can hear what Haman's suggestion is.
He said, funny you should ask. I have a list.
Yeah.
So he answered the king, for the man the king delights to honor, have them bring a royal robe to the king. Have them bring a royal robe the king has worn, and a horse the king has ridden, one with a royal crest placed on its head. And let the robe and the horse be entrusted to one of the king's most noble princes. Let them robe the man the king delights to honor, and lead him on the horse through the city streets, proclaiming before him, this is what is done for the man the king delights to honor.
So, these are big things to do. It's essentially to temporarily elevate someone to the position of the king in a way. right? They're going to put the crown, the robe, the king's horse, everything, big deal. So then here's what the king decides in verse 10 and 11.
Go at once, the king commanded Haman. Get the robe and the horse, and do just as you have suggested for Mordecai, the Jew, who sits at the king's gate. Do not neglect anything you have recommended. So Haman got the robe and the horse. He rode Mordecai and led him on horseback through the city streets, proclaiming before him, "This is what is done for the man the king delights to honor." Uno reverse.
Yeah, so this is where things start to really look bad for Haman, and we'll see that in a second. We're going to read a few more verses, but it's such a classic moment. That's just he's coming in to have Mordecai killed, and the king just so happens to have had these sequence of events. And he's like, you know what? I'm going to have you honor him publicly, which would be just humiliating for Haman, who's been sort of publicly hating Mordecai, right? Even though the king's unaware of that.
Yeah.
So then let's read the next couple verses 12 and 14.
Afterward, Mordecai returned to the king's gate, but Haman rushed home with his head covered in grief. And he told Zeresh, his wife, and all his friends everything that had happened to him. His advisers and his wife Zeresh said to him, "Since Mordecai, before whom your downfall has started, is of Jewish origin, you cannot stand against him. You will surely come to ruin." That's crazy. Wow. While they were still talking with him, the king's eunuch arrived and hurried Haman away to the banquet Esther had prepared.
So yeah, so this is such an important statement, I think, from his friends and his wife here, because they realize, they're like, oh no, they're like, we messed up.
Like,
right?
I mean, we heard about this. We heard about this their God before, and
Yeah, and we'll talk about this later too. But essentially, they're already recognizing that they're like, there's no coincidence to this.
yeah,
Like, there's something operating against us here, and this is not going well. This is bad. We don't know how the rest of this is going to get messed up, but it's going to get messed up.
yes, it's not an end.
And of course, a reminder that, of course, no one other than Mordecai actually knows about Esther's situation here. That Esther's a Jew and that she has a plan.
Yes. Well,
So as it said, we get to chapter 7, and they came while he's talking with his family about that. They're like, "You got a party to go to," and the servants come and they get Haman to bring to the feast with the king and with Esther. So they go to the feast. It's the second day, and the king, after the feast, repeats his question to Esther and is like, "What do you want? You know, I've asked you like 3 times now. I know that there's something that you want." And so Esther finally makes a request, chapter 7, verses 2 through 4.
and as they were drinking wine on the second day, the king again asked, "Queen Esther, what is your petition? It will be given you. What is your request? Even up to half the kingdom it will be granted." Then Queen Esther answered, "If I have found favor with you, your majesty, if it pleases you, grant me my life. This is my petition, and spare my people. This is my request. For I and my people have been sold to be destroyed, killed, and annihilated. If we had merely been sold as male and female slaves, I would have kept quiet, because no such distress would justify disturbing the king."
Wow. You can see, like, well, one, just note that she uses the same terminology from the decree that Haman put out. The destroyed, killed, and annihilated are verbatim what the decree said.
Yeah.
But again, even in this request, we can see that she has, even in front of this king who's shown himself through this narrative to be kind of a sleazebag, she has this humility before him.
Yeah.
She doesn't let her pride sort of like well up in front of her. And she even goes as far as to say, you know, if it had just been that we'd be sold into slaves, you know, I wouldn't have even brought it to your attention.
We can handle that. We'd been there, done that.
Normal Tuesday for my people, right? But but the genocide thing, you know, that's worth your attention. And she's actually in a similar way to like Haman when he got the king to make the decree. appealed to the king's self-interest. He's like, these people are potentially a threat to you. I'm going to donate some money, all those kinds of things. And you can see here Esther's being similarly tactful in her talking to the king. She suggests, like, if the people had been enslaved, well, at least that would be of some benefit to your kingdom. But just killing all of them is of no benefit to your kingdom. You're just wasting a potential asset. She's very you could almost say crafty, right? Just like Haman's been. You can see that Esther here reveals that she's not some just obedient girl, but that she's actually very intentionally thought and spoken, and she really lets her her humility and her intelligence here work for her. So, how does the king react to this? We're going to read verses 5 through 10.
King Xerxes asked Queen Esther, "Who is he? Where is he, the man who has dared to do such a thing?" Esther said, "An adversary, an enemy, this vile Haman." She bold. I'm telling you, she's smart too. Then Haman was terrified before the king and queen. The king got up in a rage, left his wine, and went out into the palace garden. But Haman, realizing that the king had already decided his fate, stayed behind to beg Queen Esther for his life. Just as the king returned from the palace garden to the banquet hall, Haman was falling on the couch where Esther was reclining. The king exclaimed, "Will he even molest the queen while she is with me in the house?" Hold on, I have it here. It's going to go. There you go. As soon as the word left the king's mouth, they covered Haman's face. Then Harbona, one of the eunuchs attending the king, said, "A pole reaching to a height of 50 cubits stands by Haman's house. He has set it up for Mordecai, who spoke up to help the king." The king said, "Impale him on it." So they impaled Haman on the pole he had set up for Mordecai. Then the king's fury subsided. Man, Uno reversed for real again.
I can just imagine the blood draining from Haman's face when Esther is like says what she says. I think it's like, and of course, so the king's mad. He's so mad he leaves his wine behind, which is probably the first time in the story he's done this. He leaves his wine and he leaves. And there's a really interesting, and I was curious about it. I was trying to look it up in the commentary, and the commentary also sort of gave me a shrug emoji. But there's this part where it says, "As the word left the mouth of the king," where the king comes in and he misinterprets Haman begging Esther for mercy as him attempting to assault her. He says, "As the word left the mouth of the king, they covered Haman's face." So what's interesting about that is that what my commentary did say was that this one, we see that they hang him on the pole, but as I stated before, the pole wasn't a device of execution. It was something you did with the body after execution. So sometime before the pole, Haman is killed. And it seems to be he dies here because based on our historical context, what we know, the covering of Haman's face, if it was like a hood over his head before execution, they would say over Haman's head. But the covering of face is something that you did to someone who was already dead. So all that the commentary sort of gleaned is that for some reason, right here, Haman dies. And it doesn't say, the Bible doesn't tell us what kills him. And I think that's really interesting. And we'll come back to it potentially. But I wanted to point that out, that it's like he's there, he's begging for mercy. The king comes back. He thinks he's assaulting the queen. He's like, "How dare you?" And then Haman's dead. It's sort of like, it's just what's going on. It doesn't. The king never officially tells anyone to kill him. He never pronounces a death sentence. It's after Haman's dead that he then decides, we'll put him on the pole that he meant for Mordecai. Which, of course, like you said, that Uno reverse card. The story is really just a huge story about bad guys getting their comeuppance. It's one of the reasons that makes it so compelling.
Yeah.
But one way or another, Haman dies here, but the actual mechanism of his death is left ambiguous. Then we get into chapter 8. So she reveals her relationship to Mordecai, to the king, and that Mordecai is her adopted father. And the king gives his signet ring, which Haman had, to Mordecai, and gives Haman's house to Esther, and then Esther in turns gives it to Haman. And that's not just like the house isn't the property, but in essentially all he owns and his servants and even his duties and his responsibilities.
She gives him to Mordecai?
Yeah, so the king initially gives it to Esther, and then Esther gives it to Mordecai. And the king gives the signet ring to Mordecai and elevates Mordecai into the position that Haman had. But there's still an issue. So Haman's out of the picture, but this decree is still gone out, and that day is still coming, and the people are all still at risk.
Yeah.
And so they're like, well, king, you have to stop this. But there's a problem. We've actually seen this come up in Daniel. The king can't actually undo a decree that he's left out. We're told that this is based on laws from the Medians. So they had these rules that were essentially that if a king puts out a royal decree, he can't go back on it. This was likely, the idea likely being that the king can't make a mistake. He can't be shown admitting that he made a mistake. So this decree went out in the king's name, and they can't just repeal it. But the king says, well, here's my ring. You can put out a decree in my name, and you guys do with that power what you think is wise. And he probably goes off to have another glass of wine after the tiring event of the day. So they do. They craft a counter decree, and we're going to read that here in chapter 8, verses 7 through 8.
Hold on one moment. This should be popping up. Okay. King Xerxes replied to Queen Esther and to Mordecai, the Jew, because Haman attacked the Jews, I have given his estate to Esther, and they have impaled him on the pole he set up. Now write another decree in the king's name in behalf of the Jews, as seems best to you, and seal it with the king's signet ring. For no document written in the king's name and sealed with his ring can be revoked. You hear me, Ben?
Yeah.
Okay, good. All right.
Yeah. So
this thing is scaring me.
Sorry. So here we're seeing he can't just revoke the decree, but he gives them the authority to make a counter decree. In verses 10 and 12, we'll read what that counter decree is.
Okay. Okay, it says Mordecai wrote in the name of King Xerxes, sealed the dispatches with the king's signet ring, and sent them by mounted couriers who rode fast horses, especially bred for the king. The king's edict granted the Jews in every city the right to assemble and protect themselves, to destroy, kill, and annihilate the armed men of any nationality or province who might attack them, and their women and children, and to plunder the property of their enemies. The day appointed for the Jews to do this in all the provinces of King Xerxes was the 13th day of the 12th month, the month of Adar.
So remember what the initial decree was. That initial decree said that essentially anyone were allowed to just kill any Jews, man, woman, child, and to plunder their goods. So this decree gives the Jews essentially the exact opposite rights. So the Jews now are, before I told you that there is it was complicated because the Jews couldn't technically defend themselves because to do so would be to be in rebellion against the king. That's now no longer the case. They are now sanctioned to violently defend themselves, and to the same extent that their enemies are able to attack them. And we'll actually see that later that the Jews don't actually make full use of all the rights this decree gives to them, but those rights had to be given, or else the enemy would still have an advantage and a reason to say, well, they can't do as much to us as we can to them, so we stand more to gain. So what happens?
Yeah.
So what this does is it means that, one, a lot of people who might have participated in violence against the Jews on that day now aren't going to if they were just opportunists who are like, well, they can't defend themselves and we can take their stuff. And they, so now the only people that are really going to rise against the Jews on this day and attack them are people who really have a vendetta against them. So one, it decreases the number of people that are going to attack the Jews and gives the Jews the right to defend themselves against those who do choose to attack them. Now we read actually the immediate effects of this. We read in verses 16 and 17. If you could read that for me, Jesse.
Sure. It says, for the Jews, it was a time of happiness and joy, gladness and honor. In every province and in every city to which the edict of the king came, there was joy and gladness among the Jews, with feasting and celebrating, and many people of other nationalities became Jews because the fear of the Jews had seized them.
Wow, like people even were converting to Judaism at this. They're like, no, I'm a Jew. I'm on their side. Quite the Uno revert. Now what? Yeah, keep going.
No, I didn't say anything. Do you hear me? Is the connection okay?
Yeah, there's just a delay.
You hear me, Ben? Yeah, I'm so sorry, guys. Please forgive me. I don't know what's going on with my Wi-Fi, but no, that what do you call it? No, I have something to say, but at the end, we'll talk about it at the end. I didn't mean to say anything.
So we get to chapter 9, and that day arrives, and the Jews reverse the violence that was going to be unleashed upon them. They defend themselves and they kill their enemies. However, we're told that while the decree gave them the right to plunder their enemies, they don't. They kill the people that are trying to kill them, but they don't take their stuff, even though the decree gave them the right to do that. Like I said before, in a way, the decree had to give them that right in order for there to be equal risk to anyone that might attack them. So they defend their lives, but they otherwise don't actually profit from any of this violence. We're also told that they kill Haman's 10 sons, who were, of course, part of the plot, assumedly, if they were included in the friends. And then at Esther's request, in Susa specifically, the day that they can defend themselves is extended to 2 days in the capital city. And then if, Jesse, you could read chapter 9, verses 20 through 28.
Mordecai recorded these events, and he sent letters to all the Jews throughout the provinces of King Xerxes, near and far, to have them celebrate annually the 14th and 15th days of the month of Adar, as the time when the Jews got relief from their enemies, and as the month when their sorrow was turned into joy, and their mourning into a day of celebration. He wrote them to observe the days as days of feasting and joy, and giving presents of food to one another and gifts to the poor. So the Jews agreed to continue the celebration they had begun, through what Mordecai had written to them. For Haman, son of Hammedatha, the Agagite, the enemy of all the Jews, had plotted against the Jews to destroy them, and had cast the pur, that is the lot, for their ruin and destruction. But when the plot came to the king's attention, he issued written orders that the evil scheme Haman had devised against the Jews should come back onto his own head, and that he and his sons should be impaled on poles. Therefore, these days were called Purim, from the word pur, because of everything written in this letter, and because of what they had seen and what had happened to them. The Jews took it on themselves to establish the custom that they and their descendants and all who joined them should, without fail, observe these 2 days every year in the way prescribed at the time appointed. These days should be remembered and observed in every generation, by every family, and in every province, and in every city. And these days of Purim should never fail to be celebrated by the Jews, nor should the memory of these days die out among their descendants.
And amazingly, it has not. This is still a holiday celebrated by Jews around the world, Purim. And I find the name of the holiday kind of hilarious in a way, because it's almost like making fun of Haman, because their holiday is based off of that word, as it explains there, per, which are like from the lots, the dice that Haman cast to try to figure out when he could win, essentially. And that, of course, turns around on his head. So it's so interesting that the holiday itself is almost like facetiously sort of mocking the idea that someone could have tried to overcome God's people simply by abusing fate or circumstance.
Yeah.
Um, and that actually gets into, so one of the really unique things about this book that sets, there's a few things that are unique about this book, but one that might jump out to you or might surprise you even if you read through it and didn't notice, is that God is never explicitly mentioned in this entire book.
Yeah.
which is super fascinating, and it's one of the things I'd like to talk about. In fact, it's one of our key themes. I'm calling it the God of circumstance. God, like I said, God is never explicitly mentioned in here. You don't hear God did this, the Lord said that, anything like that. None of the things that happen are by the text explicitly linked to God. But you can't read the story and think that the author has left that out because they don't think God's in these events. In fact, I think it's clear throughout it that the characters even know that God is in these events. I mean, when Mordecai tells Esther that deliverance will come from the Jews, who is he having faith in? Right? We know who he's having faith in. We know why he thinks that. And when Haman says, when Haman's family is like, you've already started to fall in front of Mordecai because he's a Jew, this isn't going to go well. They know that's because of their God that's protecting them.
Exactly.
And so if it's so clear in these moments where it's almost as if that it's almost, you can see that Mordecai would have mentioned God, but perhaps the narrator has removed explicit mentions of God for some reason.
Yeah.
I get that vibe a little bit from the book, that it's not that we're not supposed to see God. It's in fact maybe the opposite, that the author wants us to see God without telling us that God's there.
Yeah. Bible Project is something really cool. And I was listening to the overview of Esther, and they mentioned something about how, like these people, these characters, right, that we read about, these key characters, they're not necessarily even, just based on the things that they're the things they did, they're kind of like their traditions, like a Jew marrying Persian, right? Like they intermarry, right, with other with other nations, things like that, right? You see a lot of drinking, like we talked about, right? A lot of promiscuity, murder, things like that, right? So like that these people aren't necessarily moral characters or people that like that are generally should be looked at morally as like these great people you should look up to morally because they violate Torah commands, right? They're violating all these things. But despite like God's absence of his name, like in this book, and this moral compromise with these people, right? Even in someone again like Esther, though we talk about how she's wise and how she obeys and how she listens, just that violation of that Torah command of like not to intermarry, right? Things like that. Despite that moral compromise, God has not, though his name is absent, he's not absent.
Right.
And he has not abandoned his promise.
Yeah.
And who he is to his people. Like and you, like you said, you don't have to mention his name, didn't have to be mentioned for you to see that, for you to see him. Like maybe he's not straight up mentioned, but that he's working.
Yeah. I'd like
Yeah.
to hear some of what some of the people in the audience might have, any insight or questions you guys might have in regards to that lack of explicit mention of God. And in the meantime, while some of you are replying, I'll share some of my thoughts on it too. like you said, like there's that moral ambiguity to the characters. Many times we pointed out that these characters did things and the Bible doesn't even bother to tell us why, or if it was a good or bad thing for them to have done, because it's apparently not important to what the book wants to say. Well, then what is it? What is it that the book wants to say? Well, that regardless of the reasons that these people did these things, or whether they were the right things to do or not, that God was still working towards the good of his people.
Yeah, absolutely.
And I think that what's really interesting to remember is, as we mentioned before, Persia had given the Jews the freedom to return to Jerusalem and to rebuild the temple, where they could practice Torah law, they could make the sacrifices to God that were central to their Judaism. But many, including people like Mordecai and Esther, had chosen not to do that. And so there could be a question about, are we still the people of God if we don't go back to Jerusalem? Right? We're not in Jerusalem where we can worship at the temple. We're not making sacrifices. Well, remember what Samuel said. God cares about obedience more than sacrifice.
Yeah.
And that's why I said we'd come back to that. I think that's also why the topic of obedience is so important here.
Mm-hmm.
That the point is that even though they're not following all the Torah law and they're still in exile and they're not back at the temple and there's this division, there's certainly this separation from God. And the author shows that separation by removing these explicit mentions that would normally have been included, I think. When you read all of the other texts, all these times we've read stories through the Bible. We know how this works. When a king of a nation is having something to do with his sleep, we know what that means. And normally we would have been told something explicit about what God's doing. But this time it chose to leave it out. Well, I think it's really putting us in the place of these people who are not people who, like the rest of our narrative, have surrounded prophets and kings who had direct connection, direct relationship with God. These are people far away from the temple in exile. There's no prophet to be mentioned. There's no holy person to be mentioned. They don't have that direct connection to God at this time, but God is still so present.
Yeah, like that. Even though God is never mentioned, I believe it's done on purpose. Like it's as an invitation to look for Him, like to still look for Him and His activity, like who He is, like and kind of what He's doing, even though He's never mentioned. And maybe that's on purpose, done on purpose, so that we can do that ourselves, you know, and also like for us to take that for ourselves in the sense of like what do we do in circumstances where we don't necessarily hear from God, right? Like Pastor was talking about that, right? Like wanting to get revelation, right? Or wanting to hear from God, and I haven't heard from God, and what does that look like, and how discouraging that could be. But with the book of Esther, it's just trying to teach us, right? Or kind of develop this thing in us for us to look for God, like that we can see God even when He's not mentioned, right? That we can still see His activity, we can still recognize that He's working, even if there's no revelation, right? Or there's no specific mention of His name, right?
Yeah.
Like, so it's really cool. Like, I don't know if you want to say something else, Ben. We have a question.
Yeah, I saw that we had a question here.
Yes.
Hold
on, let me highlight it here.
Yeah. So asking who wrote the book of Esther, and maybe they didn't have all the information to tell the explicit details. So we don't know for sure who wrote the book of Esther. There's tradition that says that Mordecai himself wrote the book of Esther, but we don't know. The author does not identify themselves.
Mm-hmm.
And certainly say best case it's Mordecai, as he would have the most firsthand account of it. He obviously wouldn't know Vashti's reason for disobeying the king.
Yeah.
He wouldn't have that insight. But I think it's not a reach to say that the reason that many things aren't included aren't simply that the author doesn't know the answer. I mean, the author, I think clearly, whoever they are, clearly sees, for example, God's presence in the text, but they don't explicitly bring that up to the reader themselves. They don't pointed out to the readers, or do everything but do that. And we've talked about this, though maybe it was as long ago as just when we started and we were talking about Genesis. But these ancient texts, this ancient literature, is not quite like our modern literature. Like a modern novel, for example, includes lots of details, and part of the point of reading it is as you're reading it, you're sort of determining what details are relevant or not, and meaning sort of comes from that process. However, in this ancient literature, partially due to how expensive it was to write things down, only important details were included. So this book, for example, is not particularly interested in simply just recording the events that are happening, but it has a specific intent.
Yes.
And everything it includes and everything it doesn't include relates back to the intent of the story being told. This story may have been recorded directly by Mordecai. Personally, I find it more likely that it was kept in oral tradition before it was written down, and so it would have probably started with Mordecai. Though we see here that Mordecai did have something written down at the end regarding remembering to keep the festivals. But the point of retelling the story was not simply to tell history, but to also talk about what that history meant. And in this context, I think one of the things that it means is a reminder to the people that God is with them and that God desires obedience, and that those things are more important than their ability to sacrifice in the temple or where they are located on the face of the earth.
Yeah.
Or if they have access to a prophet or a priest or something like that.
Yeah. Do you want to share the answers we got, or do you want to?
Yeah. No, I think that's really important. I'd like to see what everyone has to say.
Sure. So we have Pastor Tanya. She says, I agree with you, Benjamin. The narrator seems to want the reader to see God without the mention of his name. That is how wonderful he is. Yes, I agree. Pastor Michael said, God is a spirit. He can only be seen through our actions, as we are used by him, and in many cases can be identified even in us without us ever mentioning to someone that he is in us. That's good.
Yeah.
That's good too. Lindsay, she says, it's like what Pastor was speaking about on Sunday. They ascended to their positions. Mordecai knew God would save them, and instead of just waiting on a mighty miracle or angel to tell someone to do something, they fasted and prayed and came into alignment and moved. Although God was the orchestrator of it all, they carried it out. Or he's the one who orchestrated it all. They carried it out.
I can see, and it makes me think too about, right, there wasn't an angel's involvement. There wasn't a prophet that was sent as there had been in the past. In a way, it kind of speaks to how this might have been able to go in the past. He sent prophets and angels when he had to, but he didn't have to here because he had people who were willing to be obedient to him and to seek him out.
Yeah, and you could even see that, like, well, I'm assuming based on like what we read, like we get that like feeling, I think, that even Haman's family, like you said, like they even knew.
They even recognized.
Yeah. Like, and I think it's because they recognize, this guy's Jew. We've heard about this God. Like they're God. It's not gonna end well for you. You know, like that's the sentiment I get when I read it.
And they thought they don't understand this God. They might think it's just another one of the pagan gods, and maybe and many of the pagan gods would still have some sort of slave to fate and chance and circumstance, and so they're like, well, we can still cast these lots and win over their God, but that's because they don't understand what it is that they're actually dealing with.
Yeah, exactly. So, and then Pastor Tanya, she did right. Maybe it is because it is assumed that they knew. Yeah, for sure. Like that they would know. And Esther share here, love the book of Esther for this very reason. Like they say, preach the gospel daily, use words when absolutely necessary. I think being of what Pastor Michael said. Really good.
Yeah.
Really good.
And just we're coming to the end here, but I mentioned before we started this that there's this theme of obedience that runs through this book. All of these moments that come up time and time again regarding Vashti's disobedience, even Mordecai's sort of disobedience. Again, we're not told how to react to whether or not Mordecai was right to not bow down, or whether or not this was a prideful move. We aren't told. But these moments of disobedience and obedience come up multiple times, and they reminded us of with King Saul and King Agag. But through it all, we see Esther as this example of someone who has humility. And it's so powerful, I think, too, because she's a powerful character, but not in the way that a character would traditionally be powerful.
Yeah, it's
You
like
know,
me.
I think it's so powerful. Just we see this humility. She listens to the wisdom of people around her. She has a humility. She obeys when there's a good reason to obey, but then when it's critical, she's bold. She's tactful.
Yeah,
You know,
yeah. She's what they call meek.
right?
Like she has authority and she has power, but she knows when
Yeah.
to use it and how to use it. And it's
I
cool
think
because
it's
mm-hmm.
when we see Haman, and Haman's like, you might call him crafty. He's like the serpent of the story, right? And so we kind of see this serpent versus the woman
Yeah,
situation where he's crafty, and I think it's so great that what we see is that when it comes to it, the woman's also very crafty. She outcrafts Haman.
yeah. And in the series that we're in series about the Sermon on the Mount, the Beatitudes, blessed are the meek, for they will inherit the earth. And that just points to blessed are the meek. They will have favor, and we see that here. Like she has such a favor, and I guess like the best word for her again would be like that she's meek,
Mhm.
not weak. Meek, because meek is not weak. Meek is powerful, but knowing
Yeah,
and having the wisdom on how to use that power, when to use
yeah.
it. Even her planning 2 feasts and putting it out there that she was Jewish at the right time.
And I think it can really be an uncomfortable level of like meekness. I mean, she has this humility even before, like I said, this guy that by all intents and purpose has been abusing uncountable number of women, is a drunkard, just willy nilly, decided to unknowingly, because he would, to sentence her people to death. Like, for all intents and purposes, you'd think that this is someone who Esther had every right to get up into the face of, to be mad at, to have, right? But she chooses still to be humble before him because she has greater things in mind. She has the things of God in mind.
Yeah,
It's really inspiring.
very good. Yeah. So I don't know, Ben, is there? I know we're at the end of the book, but I don't know if are we at the end of the study or
Yes, yeah, I think that's a great place to leave off. We can share our key themes. There's just the two: the
sure.
God of circumstance, um, and obey or not to obey.
Great. And that's the book of Esther. Take a screenshot if you want to study the key themes. And thank you, Ben. Really great.
I was really excited to go through this. It's such a compelling story that it's easy to retell for me because you remember it, and it's fun to retell. And as someone who personally enjoys just the art of storytelling itself, and even of just fiction writing, uh, you know, I can appreciate this story even in that context, let alone in scripture and as this historical piece of history. It's really quite a compelling story that's told very well, and I love that about it. If you were looking for a book in the Old Testament and you were like, I just want to read through at least one from start to finish, and not one of the really short ones because that would be too easy, but maybe not Ezekiel.
Yeah.
Esther's a great one because it's one of the least foreign feeling books. It reads a little bit like some of our novels have read. And so I definitely recommend it if you haven't already, reading it front to back. It's a good one. And I hadn't read it until I was preparing for this Bible study, which was months ago. I mean, God worked through circumstance in that. We don't have too much time. We don't have any time, but we were supposed to do the study much earlier.
Yeah.
And if we had, that would potentially have conflicted with what I didn't know, which was that I was going to end up preaching on Good Friday, and I would have been double preparing. And I didn't know any of that when this stuff got moved around by circumstance, but I think God knew what he was doing.
Yeah, and
So,
even the fact that we're in the month of Nissan,
yeah.
God is the one who orchestrated it. Right. Nah, and I think it's cool. It's cool you say remember. I think this book just helps us. It helps cultivate that in us to remember God
Right.
and to see Him like in all circumstances, and to understand and believe that He's working. He's not absent. Right. So good. Thank you, Ben. Thank you for taking us through Esther.
Thank
Thank you guys.
everyone for being here. Thank you, Jesse.
Yeah, no problem, no problem. Thank you guys for sticking with us. Really quick, we just have a couple of announcements before we let you guys go. I mean, if you do have to go, we understand, but really quickly, as always, you can partner with us to give. You can give to our website or app. If you're in person, you come to church envelope, but you can also scan this QR code. And we just appreciate all of you that partner with the church, that partner with us, that believe in the ministry, believe in the vision, believe in Bible study, believe in, in what we're doing, and um, all glory unto God. He's been so good. So if you partner with us already, or you decide to today, we appreciate you. And as always, Bible study alternates with prayer call. So next Tuesday we won't have Bible study, but we will have our prayer call. So please tune in. We'd love to pray with you, pray for you. We share praise reports. Believe me, God is on the move. Like we talked about, God is always working. And he's definitely working through the prayer call. We'd love to pray with you, pray for you. All the information is on the screen. If you need any more information, please feel free to reach out and share prayer requests with us. We would love to pray for you. Um, Also, we're in this. We mentioned it a couple times. We're in a new series. I don't know how this is gonna look. See, I gotta fix this for next time. But I wanted to show the graphic. This is not great. We'll have a better version of it up next time. You see me in the background. Hi. Um, we're in a new series called The Upside Down Kingdom. And it's how Jesus' sermon changed our world. Again, just going through the Sermon on the Mount. Um, Incredible. It was a great first week. We encourage you to watch it back and to continue to join us as we go through this series. Also, really quickly, I wanted to just mention again our mental health and finance workshop happening Saturday, April 27th. Again, it's a $10 suggested donation just to support, what these young ladies are, what these women are doing. We have Dr. Valerie Taylor. She's a licensed mental health counselor, and our very own Tammy Florimon, Florimon Financial. She is a financial consultant. I encourage you to take advantage of these things. It's very important. Mental health, finances, we are offering this because it's super important, and we would love to have you join us. RSVP via email that you see on the screen, tdpchurchfl@gmail.com, and please RSVP by April 21st. And that is it for announcements. So thank you guys again for joining us. Thank you for sticking with us. Ben, thank you again so much for an amazing Bible study. We encourage you, if you were blessed by the conversation, blessed by the study, share it, tag someone. If you're only able to watch half and not the other half, go back, watch them. It's a resource for you to go through this journey in the Old Testament with us. It was just really blessed us too, even though we're teaching it and, kind of leading the way. We appreciate you guys doing that. So thank you all. God bless you. Have a great night. Ben, thank you again for the
Thank
study.
you, Jesse, and thank you everyone for making it through, listening to me tell a story. Essentially, it's kind of slowly. You probably could have read through Esther yourself faster.
And it's good. We're going through it together. So
Yeah.
God bless you guys. Have a great night. We love you. Bye.